Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second episode of TechCry Q&A, where I'll be answering all of your questions on PC hardware and technology. And with that, let's get right into our first question. User GameBear4824 asks, will these two parts work together good? Will the Ryzen 9 5950 work well with the Gigabyte GeForce RTX 2080 Super OC 8GB? Now here, I'm going to assume that the user here meant the 5950X. I want to build my first PC before the end of the next year, and I'm wondering if these two parts work together well. Now, technically, with most computer parts, as long as they've been released within the same 5-year window or so and don't have any compatibility issues, so for instance with motherboard sockets and CPUs, technically different parts should be able to work together just fine. However, the Ryzen 9 5950X is definitely a bit of a baller CPU that is only necessary for those who plan on tackling heavy workloads such as rendering or other creative work like video editing. On the other hand, the RTX 2080 Super is still very much a capable GPU, but has been succeeded by much cheaper counterparts in the 30 series from NVIDIA and the 6000 series from AMD. For instance, this review from Linus Tech Tips shows the RTX 3060 Ti, a $400 card, matching or even beating the RTX 2080 Super in all titles, including those involving ray tracing. This only goes to show how much of a generational uplift that Ampere was compared to Turing. But we should keep in mind that the 3060 Ti is not even the highest of the stack in the 30 series. Right above that, we have the 3070, then the 3070 Ti, then the 3080, then the 3080 Ti, then even the 3090. Seeing as how the user has gone for a Ryzen 9 5950X, I would have almost expected them to go for a 3080 or above, possibly even a 3090. This is simply because most people who are in the market for CPUs like the Ryzen 9 5950X are simply those with a large budget that cannot stand to have any components that are simply not the fastest, or those with professional workloads that actually need that amount of raw horsepower. If this user were to exclusively do tasks like video rendering or code compiling or a lot of other creative work, then the Ryzen 9 paired with the RTX 2080 Super would make much more sense. However, if this user plans on exclusively gaming, then a lot of the extra cores of the Ryzen 9 5950X would definitely go to waste, as many of the current generation games are not able to take advantage of that amount of raw CPU power. Personally, for a top-of-the-line gaming CPU, something like the 5800X or the 5800X 3D would definitely be a much better pick, as either of those come in far cheaper than the 5950X and give up very little performance in terms of gaming. As for the GPU, again, if the user only plans on doing professional work, then something from the 30 series like the RTX 3060 or the 3060 Ti would not only have a lower power draw than the 2080 Super, but also probably match or even outperform it in professional benchmarks. Again, many people do point out that the CPU is a bit overkill for the corresponding GPU. In a latter comment, GameBear4824 asked, would a 3070 Ti be better? I don't know much about this stuff. Now, a 3070 Ti would definitely be a much better fit for the 5950X compared to the 2080 Super. This review by Gamers Nexus should help to illustrate how much more the 3070 Ti is able to outperform the 2080 Super. However, the same review also goes to show that the 3070 Ti is definitely not worth your money, and you're much better off springing for either the 3070 or just kicking it up to the 3080. But even then again, if you plan on exclusively gaming, the 5950X is still a bit of overkill. Unless this user plans on doing any other kind of work, the sheer number of cores and horsepower that the 5950X brings is simply not necessary at all. If, however, this user has their heart set on the CPU, I would just try to spring for the best possible GPU that your budget can allow for, as any other GPU would essentially fall short. In the next question, user Jocelyn1 asks, what should I upgrade in my pre-built? My pre-built is an Asus ROG, which has an i5-8400, GTX 1050, and 8 gigs of RAM on the Asus Tech GL12CP motherboard. What should I upgrade that will improve gaming at 1080p while not upgrading the entire PC? By the way, the PSU does not have a 6 or 8-pin connector for the GPU. Now this completely depends on their budget, but some options include maybe adding another 8GB stick of RAM for a total of 16. By having a total of 16GB of RAM rather than 8, this user would not only be able to do a little bit more multitasking, such as having a Google Chrome or Spotify window open while gaming, and the extra RAM should also definitely come in handy in preventing stuttering and improving those 0.1 and 1% lows in FPS. Now, the fact that the power supply actually doesn't have an external power connector for the GPU, it actually reduces our options a lot. We're looking for any GPU that, of course, does not need a 6 or 8-pin power that is faster than a GTX 1050. We're left with either the GTX 1650 or the RX 6400. The RX 6400 is marginally faster than our GTX 1650 and is much newer to boot. Now, if it was up to me, the performance difference is basically negligible in most titles, so I would try to look for the cheapest version of either card I could find that still comes with decent enough cooling. This user then clarified that they would most likely go with the RAM route and, instead of adding in another 8GB stick, actually going with a whole new 16GB kit. They were wondering about recommendations for a good 16GB kit, and were also wondering what kinds of speeds to be looking for in RAM. Now, to tackle the second question first, actually, the fastest RAM speeds that the Intel Core i5-8400 officially supports is 2666 MHz, unless they have a Z370 or Z390 motherboard, in which case they would be able to support higher RAM speeds. However, pre-builts tend to cheap out on their components, and upon further inspection, this pre-built contains a motherboard with the H310 chipset, which would not allow for higher RAM speeds. If the user is looking to save a buck and okay with the color red, then these two G.Skill Ripjaws V 16GB sticks of DDR4 2666 MHz with a CAS latency of CL19 should definitely make their money's worth at only $53. However, if they're not a big fan of that bright red, then there's also the Corsair Vengeance LPX 16GB kit of DDR4 2666 at a CAS latency of CL16, which comes in a little bit more expensive at $63. Now, this user also did say they were wondering if they should actually just go for the higher speeds instead and maybe even keep the RAM kits for a future build. Now, of course, if this user does plan on upgrading the rest of their components to parts that would support the faster RAM speeds, so more specifically the CPU and motherboard, then personally I would say totally go for it, especially because the price difference tends to not be that large. For instance, this Team Group T-Crate Classic 16GB kit of DDR4 3200 MHz with a CAS latency of CL22 comes in at less than $50. Another option includes the G.Skill Ripjaws V 16GB kit of DDR4 3200 at a lower CAS latency of CL16 and a little bit more money at $55. As you may have noticed, both of these run at 3200 MHz, which a lot of people consider the sweet spot for price to performance ratio. And that just about wraps it up for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. You might also enjoy some of my other upcoming episodes, where I'll be covering similar questions like the ones in this video, as well as reviewing some of the build lists that you guys post, so be sure to get subscribed for that. See you all in the next one.